Hi everyone, my name is Feng Chen and I will be summarizing um, Chapter 5, Perceiving, in the book About Behaviorism by B.F. Skinner. I made a PowerPoint presentation so that you guys can follow along, and I will be summarizing on each subsection of the chapter. Okay, the first subsection, Skinner distinguished between the perceiver and the receiver. A perceiver is a human being who responds to the environment by acting upon it. This is referred to as a mentalistic view, which is the most common view, that human beings initiate the action of taking in the environment. The receiver is one where the environment initiates the action, and then human beings respond to the stimuli in the environment. This is also referred to as the behavioristic view, or more specifically, the stimulus-response view. The stimulus control of operant behavior. In this section, Skinner emphasizes that the environment plays an important role in affecting the human being's response before and after a presented stimulus. Control of a response is determined by reinforcing the response in the presence of a stimulus. The response is not a reflex, but is instead strengthened to occur again in a similar event. The relationship between the antecedent, response, and consequences is described as contingencies of reinforcement. Discrimination is described as responding only to a specific stimulus and not responding to similar stimuli. Stimulus control is an event where there is a change in response in the presence or absence of a certain stimulus. Next, this section talks about conditions affecting what is seen. The conditions that affect what we perceive are also important. Skinner states that human beings' perception of the world is determined by the environmental history and what happens when we come into contact with it. Another condition that affects our perception of something depends on the strength and clarity of a stimulus, as well as other conditions in the environment. For example, if one hears a slight sound in the night, one person may perceive it as a burglar coming into the house or a mouse. What's equally important is the background of the perceiver. Skinner gave the example of a chess player who has mastered playing chess. Due to his expert skill level, he is able to predict what comes next in comparison to a beginner chess player. Similarly, Skinner points out that a person will perceive a certain way based on the contingency of consequences. This section talks about experience versus reality. Skinner reports that a stimulus can not only be explained in terms of its physical form, but to how it is perceived by the individual. Behaviorism fails to recognize how the situation looks to a person or how a person interprets a situation. It does not provide the subjective account of the individual. This makes sense because most of behaviorism takes in the objectiveness and not the subjective account of the individual. This can only be observed by the descriptions the individual states and the behavior the individual engages in. This is based on the individual's genetic and environmental history. And Skinner talks about, or he refers to the genetic and environmental history throughout the rest of the section that I'll talk about. In the behavioristic viewpoint, one cannot make the assumption that an individual's perception of the environment is derived from storing information through the senses, but by the individual's response to the perceived environment. Skinner found that reality and sensations are more consistent when there is a control on the specific contingencies of reinforcement. Individuals who do not see eye to eye on the same stimuli is said to have experienced different contingencies of reinforcement. The copy theory. The copy theory of perception states that one cannot see the world itself, so copies are made by capturing the world through the senses. It is most convincing in the area of visual stimuli, since works of art have been replicated over and over again. In the area of sounds, taste, and smell, it is less convincing to say that copies can be made due to the notion that it's an internal process. This goes back to the concept that behaviorists cannot prove what they cannot directly observe. It is hard to explain sensory perceptions in the realm of sound, taste, and smell because it is all internal, which makes it difficult to attain. The copy theory can best be explained when one considers the contingencies responsible for stimulus control. The next section, Skinner talks about seeing in the absence of the thing seen. Skinner introduces this section with dreams, fantasies in light of perception. Skinner states that the act of remembering or calling to mind strengthens perceptual behavior. He provided the example of seeing a picture of Venice by buying a photograph of it or reading about Venice. One is reinforced when one engages in the behavior of seeing Venice. Seeing in the absence of the thing seen is illustrated in the state of dreaming when one is asleep. Skinner argues that the act of dreaming is an example of perceptual behavior, and that the difference between behavior that is conscious and unconscious lies in the difference in controlling conditions. He concludes that seeing does not require a thing seen. Next, Skinner talks about the mind and stimulus control. Skinner explains what the word mind means in the English term. Mind is synonymous for someone who acts. It can also mean a person who perceives. For example, to mind means to respond when we caution someone to mind the low ceiling. Mind is also used to refer to a place where things are seen, such as things come to mind. Skinner uses the last definition of mind, a place where things are seen, in relation to the copy theory. The focus is on reporting stimuli instead of sensations when looking at the real world. This makes sense because we cannot just talk about our feelings because that would be mentalistic, but we can report on the stimuli that we do see in the world. Skinner identified the difference between two kinds of seeing. One where a thirsty man does to reach for a glass of water that is not there. One where a thirsty man goes to reach for a glass of water that is not there. And the other is a dreamer who does not know that his reality is not real. This concludes that dreams are untrustworthy because the conditions for self-observation is not evident. When one determines the contingencies that control their behavior, then self-knowledge can be made. And my question for my group is, which section of this chapter about perception challenged your thinking the most? Has it changed your perception on how you view the world? Why or why not? Thank you.